Greetings, boys and girls from Faith Bible Fellowship Church. This is Pastor Wes again with
Theo, T-H-E-O.
And
Simon, S-I-M-O-N.
very good. And we're here again today to read another chapter from John Bunyan's Pilgrim's
Progress.
Yes, and this version that we're reading today was rewritten by Anna Tremieux, and today we're in one of the boys' favorite chapters, chapter 9, where Christian meets a guy named Giant Despair at Doubting Castle. You guys ready?
Yeah.
All right, chapter 9, Giant Despair and Doubting Castle. The path away from the lovely river was rough and stony. The pilgrims were tired and their feet were very sore. On the left, a fence with steps over it divided the narrow way from a wide green meadow. There was a pretty, soft, grassy path in the meadow. Hopeful said to Christian, "Let's walk over there. It looks a lot easier." "But what if that path should lead us out of the narrow way?" Hopeful asked. "Look, it runs close to the fence in the same direction," Christian said. "We'll be fine." So they climbed over the fence into by-path meadow onto the soft and easier path. Do you think that's a good idea?
No.
Uh-oh. Christian called out to a man ahead of them. "Who are you, sir, and where does this path go?" "My name is Vain Confidence. This path leads to the celestial city," he replied. "I told you so," Christian smiled, looking at Hopeful. They followed the man. When night came, they could no longer see him ahead. Suddenly they heard a cry and a loud crash. Vain Confidence had fallen into a deep pit, put there by the owner of the meadow. Christian and Hopeful called out to him, but there was no answer. Then it began to rain and thunder with terrible lightning. Christian was very sorry. He had convinced Hopeful to take this easier path. "Let's turn back," he said, trembling. "Perhaps we can find our way again." Then they heard a loud voice. "Return to the narrow way." Christian and Hopeful tried to go back, but it was so dark and the water began to rise so high that they nearly drowned. Finally, they found a shelter and sat down under it. The weary pilgrims fell asleep. Not far from where they slept lay Doubting Castle, owned by a giant named Despair. The next morning, he found Christian and Hopeful asleep on his property. "You have no right to be here," the giant said in a loud, gruff voice. "Come along with me." Despair forced them to go with him, grabbing them and pushing them across the fields. He locked them in a very dark, dirty, and smelly dungeon. They were miserable, without anything to eat or drink from Wednesday to Saturday. Giant Despair had a wife whose name was Diffidence. She didn't trust anyone or anything. She was cruel and told her husband to beat the prisoners. So the next morning, Despair used a huge club to beat Christian and Hopeful so hard that they could not even move. They spent all that night and day lying there, weak and hungry and moaning in pain. The next morning, Giant Despair mocked them. "Why choose to keep living since you are in such awful pain?" he said coldly, telling them it would be better if they would just kill themselves. Oh, is that a good idea? No. The pilgrims pleaded, "Please let us go." This made the giant so angry he rushed at them to beat them up again. But before he got to them, he had a fit of weakness and could not use his hands at all. So he left them there. Christian said, "We are so miserable and in so much pain. Dying seems like a better choice than living like this." "But the king says, 'You shall not murder,'" Hopeful said. "How much more then are we forbidden to do what Giant Despair says and kill ourselves?" For Despair was living up to his name, trying to discourage the pilgrims so they would lose hope and disobey their king. Let's be patient and endure this for a while. We may be released, but let us not be murderers. Hopeful and continue to encourage his friend. Hold on a little while longer, he said. Maybe our great God, remember he made the whole world, will cause giant despair to die, or despair may forget to lock us in next time, or we may be able to slip away if he gets another fit of weakness. And with that, Hopeful convinced Christian to hold on to hope. Giant despair found them barely alive the next morning, and he went into another terrible rage. The Pilgrims were filled with fear once again. Christian even fainted. After giant despair left them, they talked again about suicide. Hopeful argued against it a second time, saying, remember all you've already gone through and survived. Apollyon couldn't destroy you. You made it safely through the valley of the shadow of death, and you showed great courage at Vanity Fair. And I am a weaker man than you are, Christian. Let's be patient a little longer, as patient as we can be. That night, Diffidence told her husband to take the Pilgrims to see the bones and skulls of those he had already killed. Tell them that within a few days you'll kill them too, she said, with a mean look on her face. When morning came, Despair showed the Pilgrims the bones and skulls in the castle yard and told them that he was going to kill them. Then he yelled, "Now go! Get back to your cell, your end is coming." With that, the giant punched and beat them all the way back to prison. They were very weak and faint, but then they began to pray, and they prayed all throughout the rest of the night. Christian suddenly spoke up. "How foolish I've been," he cried. "We've stayed here all these days when we could have walked out freely. I just remember, I have a little key in my coat next to my heart. It's the key of promise. I'm sure it will open any lock in Doubting Castle," he said. He tried it on the dungeon door, and with that, the bolt gave way and the door flew open. Christian and Hopeful escaped quietly out to the iron gate. The key opened the lock also, but as they opened the gate, it creaked so loudly that it woke up Giant Despair. Just as he tried to run after them, Despair had another fit of weakness and fell to his knees, unable to move. The two friends hurried from the castle and ran across the field to the steps by the fence. When they crossed back to the narrow way, they found a large stone and placed it at the steps to warn pilgrims who would come after them. The message on the stone said, "This path in Bypath Meadow leads to Doubting Castle, which belongs to Giant Despair. He hates the king and tries to destroy pilgrims." Many pilgrims who came after them read what they had wrote and escaped that danger. After this, Christian and Hopeful continued their journey on the narrow way. They sang about the king's deliverance and their adventures as they went. And that is all of chapter 9. Do you want to say bye-bye to everyone?
Bye-bye.
We'll see you next week for chapter 10, Shepherds and the Delectable Mountains.